suppose we can get started. All right, thank you everyone for showing up to the 6th week, I think it is now, of the SciAm Summer Colloquium series. Today, Jordan Fox will be giving us his talk. Jordan graduated from Seattle University with the Bachelor's of Science and a double major in physics and mathematics, and is currently a 5th-year PhD student in our joint PhD program, Computational Science. Jordan's research encompasses uncertainty quantification and machine learning applications for nuclear theory and data, and I cannot wait to hear all about it today. Go ahead and take it away, Jordan.
Great. Thanks, Abe. Let me share this. Okay. And can you see my cursor?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, cool. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you very much for coming and listening to me talk. This work that I'll be talking about started maybe a year ago at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, where I did a summer internship with Kyle Wendt. And ever since then, we've been steadily progressing on this, and hopefully we can put out a publication in the near future. So keep an eye out for that. So without further ado, this is Learning Trends in Reaction Cross-Section Evaluations using Generative Machine Learning. Although I think a more evocative title for this is Deepfaking Nuclear Reactions. So a quick itinerary for my talk. I'm going to start out by describing the data that we're interested in with this project, that is nuclear cross-sections. And next, I want to give kind of a general outline of what we want the model to do. Then third, I'll describe our whole machine learning approach. And fourth, we can look at some preliminary results that I've gathered together with predictions made by the model and some other applications detecting anomalies in data and doing ensemble predictions. And finally, I'll close up by describing what we're interested in doing in the future. So nuclear cross-section evaluations are a type of nuclear data. A cross-section is related to the probability of interaction. So in this case, imagine a beam of particles incident upon a target. That target is the nucleus in question. And because these are fuzzy quantum objects, there's some probability of interaction that we describe. That is essentially what a cross-section is, or closely related to. So on the upper left here, I've included 4 examples of what these cross-sections look like in our work. So these are inelastic neutron scattering cross-section evaluations. Evaluations means specifically that there was some cross-section data that was then combined with some theoretical models to create these nice, pseudo-continuous curves and such. So these evaluations are essential to many different applications in astrophysics and for simulation purposes, radioisotope studies in medicine, nuclear engineering, reactor engineering, and national security applications. So they're in high demand, but the libraries that hold these are constantly growing and constantly getting more dense and more complicated. And so understanding systematic trends in that data is valuable, but kind of a tall order. So it's something that I think a machine learning system is a good application for. So here I'm showing the chart of nuclides with the number of neutrons on the horizontal axis, number of protons on the vertical. And so this 2x2 set of cross sections is just, I've zoomed in basically on one area, and we're just looking at those. But imagine being able to look at the whole space of cross sections here. We would see complex trends, but systematic trends as we move across the chart, basically. And those trends are what we're after in this project. So right after that, I have to describe the data that we're working with. Our cross sections look like this. They've been normalized and standardized to lie on a fixed energy domain of 0 MeV to 30 MeV. And for this kind of preliminary stage of the project, we're only taking even nuclei. So that is a nucleus is identified by its neutron number and proton number. And we're only taking those with even numbers of both. This is due to something called odd-even staggering, which the nuclear people will be familiar with. Basically, this means that if we look at systematic trends going from one nucleus to the other in some observable some quantity, we often see a systematic trend in the even ones and a systematic trend in the odd ones, and then staggering between those two. So to simplify the job the machine learning model has to do, we're only looking at even nuclei right now, and then we can add in the odd later. So because we're only looking at even nuclei, the steps between nuclei on the chart, and this will be an important concept in a minute, are all either 2 protons or 2 neutrons, or a combination of those. So we're always going in steps of 2. And so here I want to just quickly describe how we want our model to work so we can have this image in our brains. So here I have the model we want to create. It takes 2 inputs. It takes the cross section at a nucleus, which is the nucleus N and Z. And I also want to tell it the change in proton and neutron numbers that I want, which corresponds, of course, to a direction on the chart of nuclides. So up on the chart adds protons, right on the chart adds neutrons, up and to the right diagonal adds both, etc. And the model will take these 2, we want a model that will take these 2 inputs and output a cross-section at the desired nucleus. So the resulting cross-section, in this case, that is going from NZ to NZ plus 2. Our data is organized into pairs, and this is going to be important later. So going on with this example from the last slide, let's call the first cross-section, the input 1 X and the output 1 Y. So this pair XY is actually a single data point basically in training. And from that, or on that XY pair, we can make 2 predictive actions. First, let's imagine a function G, which takes in X and it outputs a prediction for Y. So we call that Y prime. That is, G goes in the direction mapping X to Y, and that is the direction of adding 2 protons in this example. Similarly, we can imagine another function F, which takes in the other cross-section, Y, and outputs a prediction for X. So it's going in the opposite direction. F then goes in the Y to X direction, and this is subtracting 2 protons. So in this way, the functions G and F are co-inverse transforms. And this is something we'll be able to create later. But I want to explain kind of this now to have, so we have this idea in our head. We want these 2 functions that are going to be co-inverses. Okay, so now I'm going to go on to talk about some machine learning stuff. The way that we approach this problem is using generative machine learning. So perhaps some of you have heard of GANs. That's a generative adversarial network. What we're using is a convolutional generative adversarial network. And the convolutional part helps us to learn local correlations in our data. Now the GAN, the generative adversarial network, is actually 2 networks together. There's a generator and a discriminator, both of which are shown schematically on the right. So the generator is responsible for doing this transformation of a cross-section to another cross-section. This is what's going to take the place of those functions G and F that I described. The discriminator judges those predictions based on existing data that it's seen. It can judge, it will classify those predictions as good or bad, and that's part of this adversarial nature of the model. These are both, of course, coupled by a loss function, which I'll describe later. So before talking about the models in more detail, I do want to mention quickly this picture I have in the lower right corner of, this is a photo of a zebra and then a picture of the same zebra, but transformed into a horse by or transformed to look sort of like a horse by one of these GAN systems, a convolutional GAN systems. So this is from some great work that was done by a team at Berkeley. And that project is the cycleGAN project, which I'll get to in a little bit. But I just want to kind of marvel at this for a second, because I think that basically this was the initial inspiration for this project. And technically, we're not using exactly the same technology. What they're doing is something called transfer learning, or style transfer, which is different for some reasons. This is an unsupervised problem, whereas ours is supervised. But still, we're also using a lot of the same kind of components to that. So here's a couple more examples. This is their paper by Zhu et al. And I highly recommend going and looking at these pictures. They're pretty fun. So before going on to the describing the networks, I should cover convolutional layers. I'm sure some of you know how this goes, but a convolutional layer is a layer of a neural network that is set up in a particular way. We have, this is an example in 2 dimensions shown here. And so a convolutional layer has a filter that is moved across the input space. Input space is shown in blue here, and that gray 3x3 area is the filter, which moves across. At each filter location, the result goes to one output node in the output, which is this green square above. So the output is then the input in blue multiplied by the weights which sit on the filter, and we take the activation of that, and that is that's the value of our output. So I always think of this as like a dot product. Basically, it's just a dot product that scoots around on your image. Our case is in 1D, so it's actually even simpler than this. But I like the 2D kind of picture of this just for intuition. But the principle is exactly the same. So we have essentially a parameterized dot product that scoots down our vector input and produces the output that way. So now I'll describe the generator network for our model. This is called a UNet, and it's shown schematically on the right here. So each of these columns is a layer in the network. You can see that they systematically decrease in dimension for the first half and then increase back up. That's where it gets its name, because this is sort of shaped like a U. And actually, this systematic stepping down in dimension and stepping back up is really useful for getting multi-scale correlations. But I just want to, for right now, just describe this as we have the encoding sector, which is shown in blue, and then there's some latent sector, which in the middle I've chose to represent as with just an ellipsis, because one, because this figure would be too big otherwise, but also we're in our research and development of these things, we're changing a lot of the structures in there. So kind of, just take this as a schematic, basically, not a literal description of what we're using. And then the decoding sector is shown in orange. So cross sections are binned within 256 energies, like I said, over 0 to 30 MeV. And the second important thing I want to note is our encoding outputs are concatenated to the corresponding decoding inputs. What that means is you can follow these purple arrows that I've drawn on here. We have for each layer in the input sector, in the encoding sector, there's a corresponding layer of the same size and shape in the decoding sector. And so what we do with the part of the unit design is to take the outputs of the encoding layer, go to the corresponding layer in the decoding sector, and just concatenate the input, concatenate that to the input of the decoding. And so basically what this does is it can greatly speed up training, because your decoding sector has sort of a reference at every point where what that same piece of data looked like when it was being encoded. So that can accelerate training quite a bit. The third important point that I want to make here is that convolutions are an optimal architecture for getting our multi-scale energy correlations. So these, you'll notice that the taller layers here have a higher dimension. We start at 256 and march down 128, 64, 32. Those with larger dimensions are responsible for getting correlations at shorter energy scales, because the energy domain is the same as our data goes through. It's always going to be 30 MeV. At the beginning, that's binned in 256 bins, so that's 30 over 256 is about 0.1. And then as we march down, we're looking at longer and longer energy scales. So by the time we get to dimension 16 in the center latent space, that's like 2 MeV, right? So we're going up, more than a whole order of magnitude. Yeah, and so it's that kind of consecutive convolutional nature of this that lets us get those correlations. And this leads into a little PSA that I'd like to make, where when particular correlations exist in your data, we should be leveraging those with the proper choice of model, or in this case, a network. But basically what I mean by that is, if I was instead to use a simple, like, dense feed-forward neural network, and each layer was just a dense layer, so fully connected, in that case, only a subset of all of the parameters would be very important for learning, if that makes sense. It's to put that another way, I guess we would have a lot of parameters that just didn't matter that much, because they're associated with these with correlations that we know are not important. So in this case, the convolutional unit is I think the proper choice. That's my PSA. So we talked about the oh, people are in the waiting room. Okay. Okay, so we talked about the generator. Now we talk about the discriminator. The discriminator basically looks like the encoding sector of our generator, except it terminates at either 1 pixel or a vector on the output end. So this is used for classification. If you look at the input side, you might notice that it's now 256 by 2. This is because the discriminator classifies pairs of inputs. That's our XY pair that we were talking about earlier. And the discriminator learns to output a number or a vector in the space 0 to 1. And this is basically the answer to what is the probability that XY comes from our data library. So as the discriminator learns, it should learn to correctly identify XY pairs that came directly from our training data versus, and also correctly identify the generated predictions made by the generator. And in the end, once we hopefully find a balance between these two things, if the generator is doing a good enough job, then this output will be sort of random. It'll be sometimes it'll spot a fake, and sometimes it won't spot a fake. And if you can find that equilibrium, that balance, then that's one good indication that we would be done. Okay, so I've described the two components of the GAN, And now I want to describe the full predictive system that we're using. So I have to introduce a new word, cycleGAN. This is from that paper that I showed a moment ago. This was their work, and the cycleGAN is similar. I mean, it's the same as the two networks that I've described already, but it fits better with this concept of the model I described at the beginning. So in the cycleGAN, we actually have two generators. That's F and G. So these are the those two functions. We have the single discriminator that works on the pairs X and Y. And in this case, F and G, the two generators, are co-inverses. And that's exactly what we wanted in the first place. So let's look at this figure on the left. This is zoomed into a 3x3 region on the chart around iron 56. And so there's 8 arrows here. Each arrow is basically one generator. We have 8 different generators, each responsible for a transformation in a particular direction across the chart. Now, each of these colors, which contains the co-inverse pair, so up and down, for instance, are the same color, left and right. Those are the cycleGANs, or those represent the cycleGANs here. So our full system is then 4 cycleGANs that are all independent in training, but they are all then leveraged to do the same predictions in the end. So next I'll talk about the loss function that we use to optimize our network. There are 4 components, and I'll go through each one and describe basically the action that it does. And then I'll show the formulas. I feel like it's a bit more simpler to understand if I describe the action that they take rather than just showing you a formula. So I'll do both. Number 1 is prediction loss. And this is basically the, so we have our function generator F, which takes in Y and produces a prediction for X, which we call X prime. That should be going to X. Likewise, the generator G will take in X and it will make a prediction for Y, and that should go to Y. So this is basically just saying the predictions made by a generator taking one cross-section to that output cross-section. That output cross-section should be accurate to what is in the data. Number 2 is cycle loss, and this is what ensures the co-inverse property of the functions F and G. Basically, we just take the predictions that we made during prediction loss and run them back through the other way. So F takes in the prediction for Y, produces X double prime, and that should be close to X. Likewise, for G, G takes in X prime and makes a prediction for Y. So this ensures the co-inverse property of F and G, and it also has a nice interpretation for us, because if you start with a nucleus that has some properties, you add a particle to it, or 2 particles to it, and then you subtract those particles back off. The property that you were looking at shouldn't have changed overall during that process, right? So that's what this does. Number 3 is a generator classification loss, because I couldn't think of a better name for this, but basically this is the generator's capability to fool the discriminator. That is, if the discriminator takes an XY pair that contains a prediction in it, so in the case of X prime Y, if the discriminator assigns that a label 1, meaning real, then that's good for the generator. That means that the generator has fooled it. And likewise, the other permutation, if we just have, if we have X and Y prime, that also would be assigned the label real. Then the generator has fooled the discriminator. And lastly, the discriminator loss is basically all the other terms that represent the discriminator doing its job well. That is, X and Y get the label real, which is 1. And the XY pairs that contain a prediction are assigned 0, which is fake. And last thing I want to point out about these is that they're actually, you may notice that the terms in generator classification loss and the last two terms of discriminator loss are contradictory, right? What's happening here is the first three of these loss terms are being applied to the generator only. So this is how we compute the generator gradient that the optimizer uses to change the weights. The discriminator loss, the fourth term here, only applies to the discriminator. Okay. And I'll show you, just for completion, the actual formula. We use mean absolute errors for when we're comparing two cross sections, we use mean absolute errors, and when we're comparing classification labels, 1 or 0, or the output of the discriminator, we use binary cross entropy. I don't have the formula for binary cross entropy handy, but so if you don't know what that is, don't worry about it. But it's basically, I mean, I've seen people even use mean squared error or other things in its place. But binary cross entropy is basically an error function when your inputs are just classifications, binary classifications, so 1s and 0s. But that's all details. Okay, so now I want to show off some preliminary results. But I want to say the results I have here are not actually from our most current. They're not from the model, the version of this model that I'm working on at present. These are from a previous case where we had tried some things and ended up getting decent predictions in certain areas, but the model ended up failing in another test that we were doing. Basically, it had become unbalanced. I'm going to show the pictures from that because I think that this is still, I mean, if we complete the model and these are what the predictions look like, I'd be very happy. So I think that in the end, this is basically what what these should look like. We're still working on some balancing issues at the moment. But so here on the right, this is another 3x3 region of the chart. For each of these subplots, the correct or the cross-section data is plotted in black in a solid line. And each of these colored dashed lines correspond to a prediction from a generator. And you can see the arrows indicating the generator direction in the legend over on the right. So basically, the predictions are just coming from the direct neighbors. So there should be about at least eight, or at most 8 predictions on each one. And they all look quite reasonable here. There's some disagreement as to where that tail goes a little bit. There's some disagreement as to what happens at low energy. But overall, I think these look really good. But on the other hand, this is clearly a region where trends are very simple. So it makes sense that predictions are much better where trends are easier to learn and more difficult where they're harder to learn. So I'll show you another example of where they're harder to learn. And this is probably attributed to, or almost certainly attributed to, this unbalanced thing that happened with this old model, which we're trying to fix now. So you can see, actually, they could be worse, but this is certainly basically what happened here is the discriminator was completely fooled by the generator, and so the generator was sort of free to make nonsense predictions, and the discriminator didn't have a leg to stand on. It was lost. So again, this goes back to this concept about GANs, where the discriminator and generator networks should be fighting with each other constantly when you approach the optimum. If one of them wins out over the other, it can cause, well, it could either cause non-convergence, but it also can cause divergence depending on your optimization scheme and so on and so forth. So that's not what we want. We want them to be balanced as they approach an optimum. Still, I'm going to go on to show other things that we can do with this. So this is identifying anomalies in data. And this picture I have on the right is the chart of nuclides, but it's only for our data set that we're working with. And these colors represent the average error in the predictions solely from the neighbors. So it's the same thing we were looking at before here, where we take the set of all of the predictions from the neighbors, compute the average error of that with the training data, and then that corresponds to the color that you see here. So ideally, what this would help with is researchers who work on these large libraries. You know, it's not impossible for someone to just make a typo or and accidentally enter their an energy limit wrong or something like that, and that goes into if that goes into their library, it's one of many thousands of data points. So what this could do is automatically detect where things don't look, where the cross section seems to deviate from the learned trends, basically. So if you look at this picture here, you can already see there's a handful of them in the lower left and upper right corners that are red or orange like that. The other thing that this could be is data that's been finely tuned, and that's the reason why it doesn't match the trends that the system has learned. For instance, this in the upper right corner, this red spot, I'm almost positive that's uranium-234. So that's an important cross section, and it's been finely tuned by people working with it, and it just has a higher priority than a lot of these other nuclei just because of application. Carbon-12 is also in the other corner. It's been finely tuned, and that just doesn't match the attention that the rest of these have been given. And where in those cases it might come down to the model that was used to fill in the gaps. So it really depends, but I think anomaly detection is certainly something that could be helpful as a real practical tool. And the last thing I want to talk about in terms of these applications is going beyond our experimental limits. So in some cases, some cross sections cannot be measured experimentally. That could be due to, well, if you imagine maybe a chain reaction that happens in a stellar environment, right? And that might contain some nucleus, but perhaps the half-life for that is very short. So the process of making a target and doing a scattering experiment is unfeasible. In that case, we would like to be able to predict what that cross-section is, despite not being able to do the experiment because we need it for simulations and other applications. So what we can do is then basically do what I'm calling a chain prediction. So or chain extrapolation. So we start with one nucleus and then plug the predictions made back in as input and say, okay, add another 2 neutrons and add another 2 neutrons. And in this way, we can step across the chart. And if we don't have data at one place, it's, so this allows us to extrapolate into areas where we don't have data and make predictions there. And in my experiments with this, it's kind of hard to say, but stability, so meaning there's a sense of how many steps can we take before we start getting noise or before it starts looking unnatural in some way. I would say around 5 steps in my experience, but then again, we're still working on making this this model better in the end. So it could go beyond that. And what I'm excited for is what I think these chain predictions allow us to do, which is make ensemble predictions. So this is a test we did predicting the cross-section for cerium 158. If you look in the lower half of this figure, this is a section of the chart of nuclides. Cerium 158 is in the lower right-hand corner, and all of these like pastel colored nuclei are potential starting places for the ensemble prediction. And those cross sections are shown in the upper left corner of this figure, so you can kind of get an idea of the variability there and what those look like. Now what we can do is, for every starting place, for each starting nuclei, we draw out all possible paths connecting the starting point to cerium 158. And that makes up our whole ensemble of chain chain extrapolations. In this case, that was about 100, I think, maybe 110 different paths from one to the other. And in the upper right, we can look at the ensemble of all of those predictions made for cerium 158. So you can see there's kind of a cloud of predictions there. There's a bit of disagreement between each of the predictions made, but my hope is that we can boil down this ensemble into a reasonable prediction. So for instance, here I put the mean estimator and a 1 sigma confidence interval. It's not clear to me that that's the correct way to take an ensemble and boil it down to one estimator. So I'm still working on that problem, on how to kind of collect all of those things into one, but that's something I need to work on next. And furthermore, we can look at the covariances of all of these predictions in an ensemble and have a good description of model uncertainties, of theoretical uncertainties and correlations that exist in these predictions. So lastly, I'll just talk about some of the future plans we have for this project. One thing that I've been thinking about a lot is, at the beginning, I talked about the normalization and standardization of the cross sections that we're using, and I doubt that that's the optimal way to actually do this. I doubt that's the optimal way to present the data to a machine learning system. I think that if we had a separate compression model that boiled down, maybe reduced the dimension of this data and boiled it down, then that would be more palatable for a predictive model using machine learning. So that could take the form of an autoencoder, or it could just be, some algebra, some like principal component analysis description, which would obviously change the way the predictive model works, but I think that could potentially help us a lot. And the second thing is, ultimately, we want to incorporate other cross-section channels. So this whole talk, I've only been talking about the inelastic neutron scattering channel, but of course, there are others. And the correlations that exist between those channels, the cross-channel correlations, are very important. And specifically, if we could leverage those to assist the prediction process, I think that we would be in much better shape in terms of factoring in all of that information into our predictive model rather than just the one. And that's all I have to say. So thank you very much for listening. Thanks to Kyle for supporting me and everything. Thanks to Dr. Johnson, and thanks to my teammates for putting up with me talking about this for the last year. Yeah, and thank all of you for listening.
Thanks, that was really good. Is there any questions for? Go ahead, Calvin.
So that's a question that people always ask, and I forget if I've heard people ask you this before. I'm sure you could discuss with Kyle. So there's not a lot of physics built into these models, right?
Right.
It's just kind of shaping. So why does it work so well if there's not that much, physics or prior knowledge? Or maybe prior knowledge is a bad thing. I don't know. Can you?
Why does it work so well
without building anything we know about these physical systems into it?
Well, I think, yeah, we had a discussion actually just a few days ago with the machine learning group at Livermore, and so our plan pushing forward is to include physics information, basically to rewrite this. And I think a lot of the difficulty that I've been having is because we haven't really known how to properly inject physics information into this. I was going to talk about it, but I didn't want to ramble on. But we think that there's a lot of work that's recently been done there on graph neural networks, and they allow for a very natural inclusion of all these other, binding energies and masses and all this other information that that we might have even where we don't have cross-section information, right? So, yeah, my answer to your question is I think it doesn't. I think the inclusion of more physics data will help it work much better. That's certainly something we're working on. It's just within the framework that I've been working here. It's actually not trivial to say, hey, I want to also include a binding energy or something. It's not clear how to inject that into the predictive model.
Sure, I don't have a predisposed answer. I was just curious.
Is there any more questions in the chat? I do have a quick question on the staggered, the even nuclei.
Sure.
Did you try running it without that, just to see, or like first you didn't include that staggering, and then you realized that you should include it, or was the method around that?
No, we started with even nuclei only. So basically the rationale there was we could include all nuclei, but there's this excuse me. But if we did that, the model would then have to learn not only the trends that exist in these in the cross sections, but also the odd even staggering and how those two kind of combine, because we're only looking at cross sections, directly one after the other. So I think that was a decision made at the beginning, basically just to make the trends that we're after much easier to get with this model.
Do you have a model with the complementary data set? So the odd, or
oh, did we ever do that? I don't think so. I don't think we've done that yet. In principle, it's the same thing, but no, we're still, like I said, the challenge is still with this balancing thing, and that is, I mean, if you talk to anybody who does GAN stuff, I'll tell you the same thing. It's a pain getting those to optimize together. So that's where a lot of my energy has gone this year. But once we can, once we figure that out, then we can certainly expand into these other.
What are some of the strategies you tried to balance those?
Well, so I talked about those 4 loss terms, right?
Mhm.
So when we actually compute those, there's a coefficient on the front of each one. So that's kind of the most obvious thing is just tweaking those knobs.
Mhm.
The other thing I actually didn't really talk about, well, I mentioned once, but we have different, we have neural networks of different complexity. So there's a version of this model where there's that UNet generator only has some number of nodes in each layer and only some number of layers. And then there's another version of that that's the same thing, but we have more nodes and more layers in it. And then there's another version above that, basically just adding more complexity to the model. And so those, that's been another thing is trying, let's say I found a case where the generator actually looks really good, but the discriminator is going too fast. It's too powerful for these things. So then I could draw back the complexity on the discriminator and test that. So there's a lot of different things we can try.
Could those the coefficients on the loss functions, could that be where you could inject some physics?
I don't. I've never thought about that. My gut reaction is to say probably not, but I haven't. But it might. I don't know. I have to think about it. That's interesting. That might be interesting. Because basically the coefficient there is, we're using a gradient descent optimizer. So the coefficient there controls the size of the gradient norm, and that controls the step size in optimization. So if you give a larger, if you give a larger coefficient to one of those loss terms, it's essentially going to speed up the it'll essentially speed up the training in that direction. So, and then there's other components of this too, where we should be scheduling learning rates and so on and so forth, so that these things can optimize properly.
That exhausts all of my questions. I don't know if anybody else had any more. Guess not. All right. Well, thank you, Jordan. That was a wonderful talk.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for coming.
Have a great day.